Hi everyone, welcome into another Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Jeanette and I work here at the Aquarium of the Pacific where we're coming at you directly live at this time. So it is 2 p.m. today and it is the 28th of August. Thank you, Edgar. The 28th of August, 2025. And if you are tuning with us at this time and watching us live, do not forget that you can also talk and chat with us any questions you may have or any observations you might be making that I might be asking from you. All right. And that number to interact with us, to text us live questions or observations is 562 286 1838. And if you would happen to not be watching us live, maybe you guys are watching a pre recorded version a day after or at some time afterwards, you can also email us any questions. We always have someone available to respond to those questions. If you watch something and you're still wondering about something, right, you can email us live questions at live@lbaop.org. All right. So, like I mentioned today, we are actually tuning in from Long Beach Aquarium, Aquarium of the Pacific, out in Long Beach in California. So, if you're watching us live again, you guys can interact with us via this texting us live questions or emailing us at a later time. Someone will get to you. However, I am not the only one in this room making this happen. We also have my friend Edgar behind the scenes. He's also going to be working a lot of the magic behind me as well. So we're gonna get to see some really cool images and videos that he will be pulling out behind me as well. All right. So as a team, we're gonna be exploring the world of tide pools. Okay. So what a tide pool might look like is something right behind me. So this is actually a station that we have here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. This is what we call coastal corner. And a lot of the times we find tide pools in our own local coast. So this is a copy or a model of what that those coasts might look like in those tide pools. So if we take a closer look together, the first thing I want us to do is we're going to be making lots of observation throughout our time together. So I want us to start warming up our scientist brains because we're going to be doing a bit of observing and making observations because making observations is a very, very good way to learning about the world around us and sometimes learning about things we are not familiar with. So, like I said, this is an example of what a tidepool habitat might look like that we have upstairs in Coastal Corner. And I want you guys to start taking a look at what I have behind me and what are some things you might be noticing. Okay, so I'm going to step off the screen for a few seconds, but I want you to start thinking about what are some things you're starting to notice. So if this was a habitat or a home for some animals, what are some things you're noticing? Are there any textures, any colors, any specific shapes or movements you might be seeing? I know we see some ripples of the water, so that means we have a flow of water. But if you're able to also maybe describe any of the animals you might be seeing, a lot of animals that live in tide pools are very good at camouflaging and hiding. So maybe you're able to identify any of those animals. And again, if you happen to be watching us live, you can text us in that number below that you have on your screens at this time. Or if at any point you can also email us any questions you might already be having as well if you're watching us at a later time. But I really want us to start thinking about what are some things we are noticing with our eyes. I'll give you a few more seconds before I step back on the screen so we can talk a little bit about what are some things we are observing together. All right. So now that we've had time to kind of warm up your scientist brains, we're going to talk a little bit about what we are seeing here. So if we think about what we are taking a look at, again, I described this as being as a tide pool. So we're talking about tide pool critters that we have here. So some things you might have noticed is we have a variety of different animals, right? Different shapes. Like we have some sea stars that we'll be talking about soon. We have some really wiggly anemones that we're going to be talking about soon enough as well. And we have on the opposite end, maybe not so wiggly friends. They look a little bit more harder and even a little bit more spiky if you have spied any of our what we call urchin friends in our coastal corner as well. But we also see a variety of rocks, We see a variety of sediments right down here as well, right? So they're all hanging out between this kind of structure made up out of these rocks that are wrapping around. And we know they are underwater because we see a little bit of ripples in the water as it's moving around. You can kind of see it rippling through. So that means we're having some sort of movement underwater. And we know it's moving because, again, we see those ripples. And we also see up here, let's see if I could point to it right here, right? Those kind of anemone tentacles wiggling around. Okay? And what you're already noticing is a lot of what makes these tide pool habitats. So, now that we've taken a zoom and look, let's see if we can zoom out. Let's see if Edgar could give us a very great zoom out video of what a tide pool might look like. And look at this. We see a tide pool being created, right? Moving around in that water, splashing, moving around, right? Creating lots of these little tiny pools, right? So, what exactly is a tide pool? Tide pools can be found in anywhere that we call the intertidal zone. So, if we're thinking about intertidal zones could be anywhere where we have a base of water meeting a base of land. So, right in that space in between is where we can find a lot of tide pool habitats. Okay, and I've been using that word a lot. So, if we think about the word habitat, that is a home that is being created for a lot of the animals that we kind of made observations of together already. So if we think about tidal habitats, they're always happening. Thank you. Right? We have the word habitat here. So if we're thinking about the word habitat, these are homes for lots of the animals that we saw together already. And if we take a closer look, that means that these animals need to have special adaptations to be able to live in these habitats, right? So if we think about what a tide pool looks like, and we're seeing one being created, right, fully in action right behind me, right, in that intertidal zone, we see lots of tides rising, right, and tides falling. Sometimes we see shallower pools, right, pools that are not as steep, don't have as much water, and sometimes we see more deeper pools, like the ones flooded right behind me here, right, where there's a lot of water at the time, and we also see a lot of splashing and movement, right, happening between these rocks. And like we took a look earlier, sorry, we took a look earlier together, we saw that all of this movement, right, between all of this movement and this splashing, we know that there are animals that are specialized to living in this habitat. So that is what makes tide pools special. And if you've ever taken a trip to the beach, you might stumbled upon a tide pool, or you might have been what we call tide pooling, is where you go and make observations of all the interesting and cool animals you might find in tide pool habitats. And today we're going to take a closer look at what these animals are. And we're also going to focus on what kind of adaptations they have. So let's think about the word adaptations. So if we think about the word adaptations together, think about what it means. Has anyone heard of the word adaptations before? Maybe you've heard it being used as a sentence. Maybe you don't really remember what it means, right? Well, to put it to you this way, an adaptation is something you might have on your very own bodies that helps you live and survive every single day. It might be on the outside, it might be on the inside, right? For example, some things that we use every single day are our fingers, right? And specifically our thumbs as well, our posable thumbs that help us use tools, they help us bring food to our mouths, right? Another adaptation might be your heart, right? Your heart is always bumping, it's always pumping all of that blood that your body needs in order to survive. We also have our brains that help us make every single decision we make throughout our lives, right? And we also have different parts of on our bodies that build structure and provide structure for our bodies as well to keep us moving, they keep us healthy. So, we have lots of things on our bodies that help us survive the way that we survive because we are above water, we are on land. However, since these animals that I have behind me, right, that we took a look at earlier, since they are living underwater, they have their own unique way of doing things. So that means they might have something very, very different to our bodies, right, on the outside or the inside of them, which helps them survive and thrive in tide pool habitats. So, if you think about what it looks like to live in a tide pool, tide pools could be very, very changing conditions. For example, sometimes they're not going to be completely submerged underwater like we see beautifully put here in our coastal corner. On the other hand, sometimes they might be not completely submerged, right? Depending on the tide. Sometimes we have low tides, sometimes we have high tides. So depending on where they're living in these tide pool, these tide pool zones, right? Depends on what kinds of things they need on their body to help them live and survive. For example, if they're living in low tide pool areas, maybe it's in low tide time and there's not a lot of water, that means that they are going to be able to survive out of water as well. Hmm. I wonder what an animal might need to be able to survive out of water, right? We can start thinking about that. We're going to take a closer look at that together in a bit. Another challenge that they might be facing, these animals that live in the tide pool might be facing, is since they're not completely underwater, they might dry up because that sunlight is hitting them directly, right, straight to them. So that means that there's not the layer of water or maybe something else that they might need protecting them, right? So they have to be able to survive and thrive without getting completely dried up. Another thing that they might be facing is being exposed to predators, right? For example, sometimes if you're walking along the beach, we see lots of critters like seagulls, right? Maybe other birds, maybe even us, right? We're always out and about on the beach as humans. So, if we think about other predators that might be exposed, they might be exposed to any of us or maybe seagulls as well, right? So they have to be able to protect themselves in that exposed area that they are in. Okay? So, if we think about all of these things that these challenges that they are facing, let's see if we can take a closer look at what these animals are doing in order to successfully live in the ever changing conditions of our tide pools. And we have a really cool critter here. This is one of our cone snails right behind me. How could a cone cell be able to survive in the changing conditions of a tide pool? Well, right now I see that it's out of the water because I don't see it surrounded by water. That means that our cone snails are able to survive both out and underwater as well, right? That is because they don't have gills, so they don't need that ocean water in order to breathe. They're able to breathe in both conditions. So that means if we take a closer look, that snail's able to survive out of that water. However, it's not going to be able to do it for a very, very, very long period or all its life. It's going to eventually need to go back in that ocean or be submerged underwater in order to find its food. So if we take a closer look at the cone snail, I actually also have, right, there's something on its body that seems very, very spiky and maybe even hard. Do you know what that is? So on our cone snails, they have their shells. How would a shell protect it from the ever-changing conditions? Well, remember how we talked about how all of these animals are not going to be completely underwater, right? That means they need another area of protection to give them shade. That way they're not being directly impacted or affected by that direct harsh sunlight. And that makes them very, very moist on the inside. So it's going to have that protective layer. So it can squeeze its body out and it could squeeze its body back in, right? As much as it needs to. Maybe it doesn't feel safe. Maybe it feels it's exposed to the harsh sunlight. Maybe it feels it's drying up and can't really live in that condition. So it's going to go ahead and take cover in its very own portable home. That's its shell, right? So we have a variety of different snails that live in there. We also have maybe some cone snails, maybe some turpin snails that all have that protective shell on them, right? Another critter that we have here is our abalones as well. So another example on how abalones or animal snails with shells can use that shell as protection. So if you ever think about or if you ever seen an abalone, they're actually also able to come out of the water for a short amount of time and kind of sneak their way back into that water in order to get more food as much as it needs to as well. So that's an adaptation that gives them the ability to be living in these conditions that the tide pools require. Another animal, right? The one that I'm thinking about, let's see if Eder can find it. Another animal, maybe it has multiple arms. I don't think it has just one leg or one foot like our snails, but they have multiple arms. There we go. And we have found it. Do you know what this animal is? I'll give you a sec to think about it. Let's see. I know it has multiple arms. Sometimes it has less arms than the one I have behind me. This is a sunflower sea star that you might also find in areas of tide pools. But we also have a variety of different stars we can also find in tide pools, right? If we think about other sea stars that we have, right? They're able to stay on those rocks. If you've ever gone tide pooling, you might have maybe struggled, or you might have seen that these sea stars really hang on to those rocks, especially when those waves are just splashing right directly at them. Well, they don't have fingers like us. At least they don't look like fingers like us, right? To hold on. It doesn't look like they have nails to be able to hold on or scrape onto those rock surfaces. So how do you think they could hold on? I'll give you a clue. If we take a look at the sea star behind me, you can also take a look at what we're seeing now. It's behind sort of like a glass that we have here on display. And it kind of looks like it's attached to that glass. Hmm. If we take a closer look, it's not completely flat at that bottom. It looks like something's moving. And I like how we have this video here because we can zoom in and see another point of view of the sea star moving. Do you see those little tiny projections coming out from under that sea star? Those are what we call tube feet. So, not like fingers like ours or nails that can hold on to surfaces, right? They have, in fact, these little tiny tube feet that each have their own little tiny suction at the bottom. Think about them like maybe like an octopus or squid tentacles, right? So they have lots and lots and lots of all of these tiny suction cups or tube feet, like we talked about, under their body, and they could hold on to surfaces. They are also able to move. I know from working here, I get asked a lot if sea stars move. And the reality is, the answer is, they do move, right? They, however, move very, very slowly. But with those powerful little suction cups all working together, right, they can get really, really strong holds of surfaces, like the glass that we saw earlier, and even rocks in tide pools. So if we have all of this splashing happening, right, we're getting all of these little suctions holding on. That way they're not just whiffed away with those splashes or those tides, right? Because tides could get very strong and dangerous sometimes. But with the adaptation that they have there with those 2 feet, they're able to really hold on to surfaces. All right. And they might look like this exactly. So again, even with those conditions. And you might notice here as well, they are actually out of the water, right? I wonder what helps them survive being out of the water. Why doesn't a predator maybe come and just drop by and maybe take a bite of them, right? Well, if we zoom in closer and actually have a dock cam here, let's see if we can zoom into our dock cam, right? I'll meet you guys over here on our dock cam. I have a bit of a variety of different critters we can find, but the one we were just talking about is our sea star here. So, sea stars actually have, if you've ever touched our sea star, maybe you visited our aquarium before, or you've been tide pooling yourself, right? If you ever touch one of the sea stars, you might notice that they are a little bit bumpy and textured as well on the sides. Let's see if I could get a really good view, right? You can see all these little tiny bumps along the surface of our sea stars. That is because our sea stars are in a family that we call echinoderms. So echinoderms kind of directly translates to spiky or spiny animals, right? Spiny skinned animals that we can think of. So for these echinoderms, all of these little tiny spikes and the roughness of their skin, right, makes them really, really hard as well. So if we're thinking about being easy to eat, the sea star has a protective skin layer that makes it very difficult to eat. So that means they're able to survive against predators out in the open for the most part, right? Because they have very those spiny skin and very hard skin as well. So not squishy or soft at all. They have a really good structure as well. So that's what makes up our echinoderm family. And since we're here, right, I'll also show you a bit of these snails as snail shells as well, right? So if you look at the shell, this is where the inside where we would have any sort of snail living on here, right? But if I tap on it, it's a very hard surface as well. And it's going to cover the entirety of the body of the snail as well. And they're able to grow with their shells sometimes. I know for the most part, we have some turban snails that look a little bit like this, probably not the same color, right? But we have some turban cells that just continue growing and growing with their shells. Unlike other animals that we know, maybe like hermit crabs, that have to move their shells, find a bigger shell when they are growing out of the one that they are in, right? For our snails, they're able for the most part to grow with their shells. So that means they have extra protection covering their bodies at every time. So as their inside body, that squishy part in the middle, as their inside body gets bigger and bigger, so does their little turban, you might say, right? So this loop around here, right? It grows with them as well. All right. So now that we talked a little bit about our more harder shelled friends, right? Let's think about what we can find in that coastal corner again. Let's see if Edgar could take us back to our coastal corner to see what else we can find living in it. So earlier again we talked about a little bit about our sea stars, right? We talked also about our snails as well, right? Our snails might be harder to see in this image. They're even stumping me. I don't think I see an active snail out here, right? But we do have some at Coastal Corner, right? But let's see if we can find a spiky friend. Hmm, maybe not as smooth as those snails, right? Maybe a little bit even more spikier than our sea stars. But if you take a look all the way down here, see if I could point to it all the way right there, right? We have our urchins here. So urchins are also able to survive out of that water and in that water as well. So if we can zoom in, let's see if we can find a really nice urchin picture so we can take a closer look at our spiky friend. So what we have here is what we call a purple sea urchin. And purple sea urchins are actually, you might have caught it, but they are also spiny friends. So that means they are in the same group as our sea stars. Our sea urchins are also what we call echinoderms. Again, those spikes. And like we talked about earlier, those spikes are used as protection. For example, if I were munching on anything underwater and I took a look at that sea urchin, or you took a look at that sea urchin, would you like to take a nice big bite of that sea urchin? Just like that? Hmm. Probably not, right? I know I for sure wouldn't want to do that because most likely it would be very, very painful. And other animals underwater and maybe those seagulls hanging out in those tide pools, right, are thinking the same way. So they're not going to want to eat any sort of spiky friend. It's going to be way too hard to crack them open, right? And it's going to be way too painful for them to chew on. So what these sea urchins do is they use their spikes as a layer of protection. And they also use those spikes, if you see maybe them wiggling around, they can move very similarly to those sea stars as well. So with those spikes and with those little tiny 2 feet, much like the sea stars, they're just a little bit longer, they can hold onto surfaces as well. So they're not just pom-poms swimming about on that ocean with those tide pools, right? Or with those tides or splashes of those tides. They're going to go ahead and hold on to surfaces really, really well. Just like that. They're going to find a nice station spot and they're going to kind of shimmy their way in there and they're going to hold on with those spikes really, really well. And those sticky 2 feet. And we can actually see those sticky 2 feet moving a little tiny bit. See if I could point them out right here. They're very, very thin and a lot longer than the sea star's 2 feet as well. But they look like if they're wiggling out around there, right? Kind of like little tiny worms coming out. Those are actually their 2 feet, and they do have a bit of suction onto them as well. So, another way that they also protect themselves is they are very good at camouflaging, right? You might think, but how? They're a nice bright purple or sometimes even red. They're going to pop out, right? Well, they actually use things around them to be able to hide. So, some of our sea urchins here even we can kind of see that behavior here at our aquarium because we kind of notice or we see them if you ever visit us, we see them kind of putting rocks on top of them, right? We always like to say that they kind of like to wear them as little tiny hats, kind of like disguises. That is because that's exactly what they're doing. They usually disguise themselves with any sediments or any sort of rocks all around, little tiny rocks, anything manageable to pick up with those 2 feet. And they kind of shimmy their way under all of those and they kind of disguise themselves to look like a part of that sediment. And that's kind of like what they're doing here as well. So they're kind of finding a good snug spot to kind of deep their way into, and that way they feel protected as well. So even though we have lots of those harsh splashes with those tide pools, they are very, very safe in the place that they are and very well protected because of those spikes. All right. So we've taken a look at our sea stars. We've taken a look at our urchins, right? And at our snails. So maybe we can have time to look maybe one more animal. Let's see what we have. I know we have maybe some wiggly friends, and Edgar just read my mind because we know we have some wiggly friends that we took a look at earlier. So these are what we call our anemones, right? In our anemones, we also notice they have all of these wiggly tentacles, right? And they look very, very squishy. That is because they are. So for our anemones, they're able to be very, very squishy, making them movable with those waves. So if you ever see an anemone underwater, you're gonna see it moving to the pace or the movement of that water, just like we have here, kind of like if they're doing a little dance, right? That is because they are very squishy and movable because they are what we call invertebrates. So meaning they don't have any bones. So if we were to be very, very well structured underwater, right, we would feel all that pressure against us. But since they are very, very squishy, it makes them more manageable to be maybe even squished to a certain level, right? That way it doesn't feel all of that pressure of those splashes or maybe even exposed to that sunlight. Because they are very flexible, and whenever they are exposed to sunlight or maybe even touch, sometimes if you ever gone tide pooling and if you maybe come across and touched one of these anemones, you might notice it's going to go whoop and kind of close up, right? So they do that to protect their insides, right? Because that is where their mouth and a lot of their systems are inside of their bodies, right? Down that center. So they do that to kind of stay away from the sun, right? They don't want to be spread out just like that, wiggling their tentacles all over the place when they're out of that water. So we've learned as a recap, right? We learned a little bit about our coastal corner. We learned about what tide pools are. But now it's a chance to think about what we can do, right? Because what we can do impacts a lot of these tide pool habitats. Like we learned together, a lot of animals depend on the success of tide pools in order for them to survive, right? And I want us to start thinking about what we can do to help out and support our local tide pools. Like we said, we find tide pools in intertidal zones. So that means they're wherever the ocean meets, right, that land. And a lot of the times, just like this, right, a lot of the times when that happens is where we're most likely hanging out, maybe more in the summer or at any point of our lives when we go to the beach. So that means us as humans, we heavily impact the conditions of our tide pools. So, as a scientist, one thing we can talk about is how can we help with the conservation of our tide pool habitats just like this, right? One thing you can think about is maybe when you visit the ocean, right, leaving it as it is. For example, I know some of us like to take picnics, right, out in the ocean, making sure that we throw away our trash in the proper receptacles, right? Making sure that we are recycling, we're reducing, we're reusing, because a lot of the times that all of that trash and all of that pollution ends up as runoff towards that ocean, right? And lastly, another thing that you might be able to do that we do already is spreading information, right? Just by you joining us today and becoming more knowledgeable of all the conditions and all of the life that exists in our tide pool habitats, right? And spreading that information is already a really well way of educating others around us, right? Maybe you can talk about with your grown up next to you, or maybe anyone you know, maybe your friends at school or your teachers, right? Maybe you'll be able to discuss the importance of this habitat because of all the creatures that live in it. All right, my friends. It was very lovely for you to have you join me today for another Aquarium Online Academy. Again, if you didn't happen to catch us live, do not worry. You can always email us your questions at live@lbaop.org. And if you are tuning with us live, right, we also have another special coming in Aquarium Online Academy at 3 p.m. today as well. All right, my friends. Again, my name is Jeanette, and it was a very lovely time exploring with you today. I'll see you next time. Bye.